Thanks for that very kind introduction, Ingrid. And I was going to scratch a few notes for a speech last night when I arrived, but I instead met a lot of lovely people in the bar in the Highland, made a few new friends here from around the area. So, but their kindness and hospitality meant that I never kind of got to write anything. I have a few stats, though. We might get to the stats. We'll see. But I mean, let me start by saying that what I think is at stake in a debate about equality, because I mean, inevitably we need to talk about statistics and evidence and all of that. But I do think we need to start with the human reality of what inequality can mean and what it does. And I would propose to people that inequality is an absolute poison in our society. Not just in our society, but in any society. For the victims of inequality, it breeds demoralisation, lack of confidence, resentment, anger, sometimes violence, sometimes on a more positive note, resistance and politicisation. But for much of the time, it can do immense damage. It can literally be a torture for people to be treated unfairly, to have less opportunity than other people. And for me, therefore, the struggle for equality at every level is the great struggle of our society. It should be the objective of politics and policy. And I'll go on to explain why I don't think it is, but I absolutely assert that it should be. The reason I got involved in politics, because I was studying English literature in UCD and frankly had no intention of getting involved in politics. But I went with a few friends who were from a working class area. I was from a middle class background, but they were from a working class area, and they didn't have the opportunity to go to college, and so they had to go to England to work on building sites and asked me to go with them. And that was, if you like, my first taste and understanding of inequality, that young people who were just as intelligent or unintelligent as I was, had just as much energy, had just as many hopes as I had, didn't have the opportunity to go to university and had to leave the country to go and work on building sites in England. And I went with them. For me, it was just a year out, because I had something to go back to. For them, that was the only way out of the mass unemployment that the country was suffering back in the late 1980s. So we worked on building sites in London, building council houses. And after 6 months or so there, we decided with a little bit of money that we'd earned that we would travel and go somewhere exotic. And we couldn't really figure out where to go. We didn't know much about the world. So we decided to get a one-way ticket to Tel Aviv. And we could only afford a one-way ticket. And this happened to be in 1987, in November of 1987. When we got there, we were a little bit alarmed about what we started to see. Interestingly, they wouldn't let us on the kibbutz. I think because my friends had tattoos. They didn't like the look of us, so they wouldn't let us on the kibbutz, which was the sort of idealistic thing we thought we were going out to, a sort of communal, socialistic type setup. So we weren't allowed on, which was quite alarming, seeing as we only had one-way tickets and didn't have the money to get home. But then we were informed about these other things called moshavim, which are more commercial farms, where they work you, down in the desert, on the Jordanian border, in the Negev. And we were sent down there. And They split, two of us, there was four of us, they split us up. They didn't want us together. They thought we might be problematic. So I remember getting off the bus at Saddam Junction, as in Sodom and Gomorrah, which was quite stunning in the middle of the desert. But I arrived into this moshav surrounded with fences, military watchtowers, sleeping on the first night. There was shooting going on constantly all around me. I woke up the next morning and went out into the desert and started picking melons, and the fields were surrounded with barbed wire. At one point I went to, how could I say, relieve myself at the side of the field, and suddenly realised I was in a minefield, which is quite terrifying. But anyway, I'm sort of digressing a little bit, but as I was working my way up the field, I met somebody else who was in the field, and I said, "How long have you been in Israel?" And the person said to me, "This isn't Israel, it's Palestine." And they were a day labourer from a refugee camp in Hebron. And as I got to know this person, they explained that their family had been displaced in 1948 from their village in what is now called Israel, and had dumped in the mountains in the West Bank, and had been living in a refugee camp ever since. This man was highly educated, university educated, but he was working picking melons. The universities have been closed down by the Israelis, 80% unemployment among the Palestinians, no future. And literally 2 weeks after I arrived, the first Palestinian Intifada broke out, which was a rebellion of young people against the Israeli occupation, demanding a future. And I was utterly inspired. I mean, I was horrified at what they were suffering, the plight they were suffering, but I was totally inspired by these young people standing up and saying, "We're not going to take this. We don't accept that some people have a future, people, in fact, who are living on the land that was taken from our families, and that we have no future." They weren't bitter, actually, amazingly, for the most part, against the Jewish settlers, but they demanded equality. They insisted on equality, something they are still denied. So those two experiences, both of my own friends having to leave the country for economic reasons because of the lack of quality here, and then seeing in the most stark and shocking terms a whole people who've been denied basic equality as human beings, civil rights, any rights. I mean, even today, Palestinians literally have no country. Their travel documents aren't accepted anywhere. We were trying to bring an under-14 football team last weekend from Gaza to play a football match here against Bohemians and against Ballybrack, which is a working class area in my own area, and they were left waiting for days at the border of Gaza, denied exit from Gaza by the Israelis. 14-year-old children, for purely vindictive political reasons. We're not going to let them out. We don't want the world to see that they are human beings the same as the rest of us. Imagine what that does to you. Now, nothing can justify the horrors we saw in Nice in the last week. Nothing. It's unconscionable, despicable act. But unless we understand what it does to people, to Arab people, to Muslim people, to Palestinian people, when they are treated for years, for decades, when they're denied their humanity, when the world refuses to acknowledge that they have as much right to participate equally in the world as anybody else, is it surprising that some people, literally, their minds are made sick by that? That they lose respect for the rest of society, become so alienated from it that they think taking innocent life is somehow a legitimate action. To me, there is a direct relationship between these two things, and unless we understand the urgent need for equality, then all the hand-wringing and condemnation in the world will get us nowhere. And similarly, when we look at the proliferation of armed and gangland crime in this country, and you see people shot down in the most appalling circumstances, which you must condemn, which is utterly unjustifiable, often done in the pursuit of money or drug profit or whatever. And that's terrible, and it must be condemned, but simply condemning it and wringing your hands is no good if you fail to acknowledge that by and large you do not get gangland criminals coming out of Foxrock or Killiney or Dublin Bay North, that they're concentrated in areas of high deprivation and poverty and alienation. And that is a fact. I mean, I hope I don't even have to enumerate the statistics. I think it's just obviously the fact. So, to me, at every level, equality and the fight for it has to be, if you like, the central objective of policy and politics. Otherwise, it will unravel our society. And I think a lot of people look around what's happening in Ireland, when they look at that gangland crime, or when they look at events like Nice, when they look at what's happening in the Middle East, and they literally think, Jesus, the world is falling apart. It's unraveling. And I think there is a connection between that and a dramatic and frankly obscene growth in inequality in the world, in the distribution of wealth and resources. A shocking growth. Captured most dramatically in the Oxfam report that was produced earlier this year, that showed that the richest 1% of the world's population now own more wealth than all of the rest of the world's population put together. I mean, that is almost impossible to get your head around. That level of concentration of wealth and inequality that has grown exponentially, particularly in the last 25 or 30 years. The more, to my mind, the more that inequality grows, the more we will see society unravel and see the sort of horrific manifestations of conflict, of alienation, of anger and of resentment that can produce such horrible effects as those that we saw in Nice or gangland crime or all the other manifestations that we can witness around the world. So that, I think, is what's at stake in this debate, and I think it is a very, very urgent matter indeed. Now, I mean, to bring all this down to what does it mean politically, and why is this happening? You know, why is this inequality growing? And I think it is very, very simply because a consensus has developed, particularly over the last 25 or 30 years, that we should essentially abdicate responsibility for the allocation of resources and wealth to a thing called the market. And, I mean, often, you know, week to week or day to day in politics, you're dealing with the sensation of the day, the story of the day, the particular issue of the day. But a summer school like this is an opportunity to stand back a little bit and think, you know, what is the overall pattern that we are witnessing? And I think it is self-evident to say that, particularly since the sort of Thatcher-Reagan period and the advent of what they call neoliberalism, but which to me is just sort of tooth and claw jungle economics of letting the market rip, letting profit dictate the allocation of wealth and resources. And it has produced this shocking and growing and obscene gap between the haves and the have-nots that is accelerating exponentially and is producing such damage and conflict in our society. And there's lots of stats to back this up. I mean, I won't bore people, but the Oxfam one is one. In terms of wage share, for example, the proportion of the cake, either in this country or globally, the figures are more or less the same, that is now going to workers for work as against what's going to profits and what do you call those things you get off shares? Yes, dividends. Wages has dropped, I don't have any shares, has dropped 20% over the last 20 years as a share of the overall economic cake, and you've had a corresponding rise in the proportion of profit. Property and land, the concentration in this country is extraordinary. 20%, the richest 20% of the population own 90% of the land. 90%. Do you need any further explanation as to why we have a housing crisis than that fact? And I'll throw in a little barb to the government and the recent housing strategy announcement. When you set aside all the stats and all the noble rhetoric and aspirations, one of the key facts of the Coveney Housing Plan is that it is planning to further privatise what's left of the public land bank in order to entice the private investors to provide the low-cost housing we need. I mean, to me, that is just a contradiction in terms. We have to sell off public land and give it to private investors to make profit in order to get a few crumbs back from them in terms of the social housing we so desperately need to deal with a housing crisis that has spiralled out of control. Now, I propose, actually, there's a much simpler solution, that we use the public land that is available and the land we were forced to nationalise via NAMA, and for that matter, the banks and the money they have, which we bailed out, to build low-cost public housing on public land. And if we could do that in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s, don't tell me we can't do it today when Ireland is a far wealthier country than it ever was then, when we were a borderline third world country. But the reason it's not happening is, as I said, the adoption of this neoliberal, leave it to the market, let the market rip approach. And at every level, it is producing inequality. And you can see that working its way through in policy. I mean, in almost every front, inequality and deepening inequality is the name of the game. In the health service, we have a two-tier system. It's as simple as that. If you have money, you get a health care immediately. If you don't, you're on a waiting list for 2 years and growing. Or you wait for hours or days on a trolley. That is obscene. And it is worse now than it was when I was a child, and I suspect when you were a child, when you could go to the local hospital and you didn't have to wait 2 days to get seen in an A&E. Isn't that an extraordinary indictment of what's happened? I'm not saying Ireland in the 70s was perfect or the 60s, but you didn't have to go through that. The two-tier has got worse. In social welfare, we have it now, where young people, just because they're young, job seekers, get half of what somebody is older. So it's been slashed for young people by this government. In education, we have a two-tier education system, and have had it for a long time. And frankly, you can go through the list of inequalities. And to me, that is the inevitable consequence of letting the market rip. Because you see, what is the elementary thing one can say about competition for profit? Is it's about winners and losers. That's how competition works. There's winners and there's losers. And in any competition, there's one or two winners, and most people are losers. And as the competition develops, the number of winners gets fewer. Just look at the Premier League football in Britain and the concentration of power into the hands of a few corporate-backed football teams. I mean, that's a light-hearted example, but that process is evident everywhere. If you base the allocation and the distribution of resources and the prioritization of resources on a jungle-like competition for profit. So I propose we have to reject that. Otherwise, we are facing not just into deeper inequality, but literally into the unravelling of our society on the sort of horrific scale that we are beginning to see with the situation in the Middle East, with with the rise of the far right in Europe, with the sort of deepening inequality that can produce some of the stuff we have seen in our inner cities over the last few years. Now, I'll just conclude because all of that is a rather grim scenario, but I do want to conclude on a positive note, because you see, the other thing that inequality does produce is resistance. It always produces resistance. People who know this is wrong and demand something better. And I think the flip side of the coin of growing inequality is, in fact, a new awakening of people across the world demanding a fairer and more equal society. And the rise of new movements of people power all over the world. In America, behind the Bernie Sanders campaign, incredible fact that America, where you couldn't even mention the word socialism now, a candidate almost got the Democratic nomination, saying much of the same sort of things I'm talking about now. In Greece, the enormous social movements against the austerity that we've seen there. In Spain, new political movements emerging out of the resistance to austerity. The movement behind Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. And here, the movement against water charges, which wasn't just a movement about water charges. Water charges were the last straw. But what was extraordinary and hopeful is that that movement saw people coming together in rural Ireland, in urban Ireland, in villages and towns, the length and breadth of the country, and saying, we're actually going to intervene in the process. The masses of people who are largely ignored, who are not listened to, are going to intervene and demand something better. And to me, that is a very, very good thing. Notwithstanding some of the demonisation, I saw one article in the Irish Times which suggested these people on the streets were like the barbarian hordes that sacked the Roman Empire. Although, in fact, sacking the Roman Empire wasn't such a bad thing since it was built on slavery. But actually, to me, that is the movement of hope. And you only had to be on the streets at those rallies in Dublin and when they happened all over the country simultaneously to see the sense of hope of some of the poorest and most disadvantaged communities coming on the street and saying, we want a different world. We want the resources and the wealth and the income to be shared out in a fair way. And that sort of community mobilisation and linking up into a wider people's movement demanding a fair and equal distribution of wealth and resources and power and a real democracy that means something to people is a great hope. And we need to build on that hope. And frankly, I think if we don't, the future could be very bleak. But it's up to us. It is up to us. Nothing is predetermined. And people have to make a decision, I think, to engage, to get involved. And I think if people do that, then the agenda that they need to pursue to bring about a better and fairer world is the agenda of equality, insisting that equality is the precondition of a civilised and decent society.